It can be easy today to take police investigative techniques and forensic technology for granted. But back in the 1800s, not even fingerprinting was utilized, never mind DNA analysis and the MVAC system, which today is an invaluable tool for forensic investigators. As a result of this lack of technology, cases were often solved by witnesses and confessions, though many investigations never saw a resolution at all. In today's episode, we'll be looking at a few examples of such inquiries as we examine 3 gruesome 19th century cases that were never solved. Jane Coulson, the Eltham murderer. 17-year-old Jane Maria Coulson was discovered at around 4 o'clock on the morning of April 26, 1871. Battered, bleeding, and barely conscious, she was lying in Kidbrooke Lane in Eltham, southeast London. She had been bludgeoned with a hammer, which was located nearby, covered in blood. Jane's purse, containing 11 shillings and 4 pennies, had been left untouched, and there was no evidence of sexual assault. This led to the idea that the attack had been either personal or carried out by a random, violent stranger. There was no motivation for money or sexual abuse. Due to the nature of the beating, Jane was difficult to identify right away. She fell into a coma for 4 days before dying on April 30th. Before her death, she named Edmund Puck, a young printer from Greenwich, as her attacker. Puck was 24 years old and the son of her employer. Jane was a maid and had been having an affair with Puck for several months. She eventually became pregnant with his child, but he refused to marry her. His brother had already angered their father by taking up with a woman of a lesser social class, and Puck didn't want to do the same thing, as it meant he would have to endure the stress and difficulties of fighting with his well-to-do family. Still, word of the affair emerged, and Jane was fired from her job. In response to Jane's claims, though, the Puck family fired back. They alleged that Jane lost her position because she had been given several warnings and had failed to improve her behavior in response to them. They stated that the 17-year-old had been spoken to about her unkempt appearance and careless work habits, and that she was let go because both issues had persisted. There were allegations that Jane and Puck had continued their relationship even after she lost her job, that they met in secret and sent romantic letters to one another. However, no letters, nor any evidence that they existed, were ever found. Jane's cousin recalled that she often spoke about running away and eloping with Puck and starting a new life. Reportedly, witnesses saw a man matching Puck's description running from the scene of the crime, and there were assertions that he had been sold the hammer by a local shopkeeper in the days leading up to the assault, although the shopkeeper couldn't remember the man who'd purchased it. Puck, for his part, sometimes claimed that he had been nowhere near the lane, but at other times said that he was running because he'd felt a fit coming on and needed to get home. The clothing he described wearing on the night of the crime matched the description of Jane's assailant. Meanwhile, 7 witnesses were said to have seen Puck and Jane in one another's company earlier that evening. The case against Puck, at a first glance, seemed strong, but somehow it all went awry. At the initial coroner's trial, Puck was found guilty of the willful murder of Jane. Following this, arrangements were made for Puck to attend a proper trial at the Old Bailey. The date was set for July 10th. During the trial, the presiding judge ruled that all statements made by Jane prior to her death were hearsay, and therefore could not be included as evidence during the trial. Jane had named Puck as her assailant, and without this important piece of evidence, the prosecution struggled to undoubtedly prove Puck's guilt. Reportedly, several of their arguments came apart when placed under scrutiny by the defense. It took only 20 minutes of deliberation for the jury to acquit Puck, 5 days after the trial started. Despite the fact that Puck walked away as a free man, the people of London were angry and would not drop the matter. Newspapers constantly railed against the 24-year-old and implied his guilt, and when he walked out of court, he found a frustrated mob waiting for him. Many locals believed that he had escaped justice because of his wealth, social class, and family connections. Puck and his family subsequently left London. The press continued to badger them until they eventually changed their name. Jane was interred at Brockley Cemetery alongside her mother on May 8, 1871. Although justice was never found for Jane, her legacy lived on even after her death. Her ghost was reportedly seen numerous times in Kidbrooke Lane, including by patrolling policemen. She appeared wearing a white dress, her face running with blood, as she cried for help. Locals began to avoid the area until it was built upon, and the ghost vanished. Charles Bravo. Charles Bravo was born Charles Delaney Turner in London in 1845, adopting the surname Bravo from his stepfather. Charles was a well-educated man, studying at Trinity College, Oxford, and in 1870 he qualified as a barrister. He married Florence Ricardo, the daughter of an Australian-born politician named Robert Campbell, in December of 1875. They had met 1 year before. Prior to their marriage, Charles had told Florence that he'd had an affair for 4 years and a daughter whom he never saw, who was a product of the relationship. Florence, likewise, admitted she had secretly been seeing her doctor for some time, but had ended the relationship shortly before they met. Florence was independently wealthy. She had been married 10 years earlier to a military man who had cheated on her numerous times and eventually died of alcoholism. When the marriage dissolved, she began seeing her doctor, a much older man who repeatedly promised to marry her. However, the relationship was exposed, and Florence became socially ostracized and cut off financially by her parents. By this time, though, she'd inherited a healthy lump sum after the death of her ex-husband, who'd failed to write her out of his will. Though Charles and his wife appeared to have a rather good relationship on the outside, police inquiries later revealed that Charles was controlling, mean, and a violent bully. Notably, Florence's wealth caused some strain in the marriage, as she opted to keep her finances separate thanks to a recent law named the Married Women's Property Act of 1870. When Charles discovered this, he reportedly threatened to call the wedding off. Furthermore, Charles insisted on interfering with Florence's lifestyle. He wished to sell her horses, fire several of her maids, and get rid of both the gardeners, something which Florence did not like. Charles was also known to feel threatened by Florence's former lover, Dr. James Gully, who still lived nearby. Charles received 3 letters after they married which accused him of marrying Florence for money, and stated that she was still Dr. Gully's mistress. Then, in the spring of 1876, he was poisoned with tartar emetic, a derivative of antimony. His demise was drawn out, lasting several days, and painful. Symptoms of antimony poisoning include redness and itchy skin, coughing, wheezing, shortness of breath, headaches, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and loss of sleep. By all accounts, it is a grisly way for one's life to end. On April 18th, Charles returned from a horse ride in great pain, looking exceedingly pale. He was irritated all throughout dinner and complained of toothache, then became angry upon receiving a letter from his stepfather who warned him about playing the stock market as he had lost money. He also scolded Florence for drinking too much, noting that she'd suffered 2 miscarriages in the last 4 months. In the middle of the night, the house staff were alerted to Charles's distress when he began shouting for his wife and was found vomiting out the window. There are several theories as to who poisoned Charles and why. The most obvious suspect is his wife, with many speculating that she had been slowly poisoning him over the short course of their marriage, using antimony in the form of tartar emetic. It would account for the chronic illness Florence suffered from once they tied the knot. However, Mrs. Cox, the couple's housekeeper, claimed that Charles had once accidentally swallowed some laudanum while treating himself for toothache. He then consumed some tartar emetic after mistakenly believing it was true emetic that would induce vomiting. According to Mrs. Cox, Charles told her of his mistake when they were alone together, although she later changed her statement. Other theories about the poisoning included suicide, that Mrs. Cox, whom Charles had threatened to fire, had carried it out, or that a groom who had been let go had poisoned him in revenge. It has also been suggested that Florence used the poison on him in an attempt to lower his libido, but that she botched the dosage and gave her husband too much, resulting in his slow and agonizing death. Charles died on April 21st, 1876, at the age of 30. He had been married to Florence for 5 months. 2 inquests were held to take a look into the matter, and it was considered so sordid that women and children were banned from the room while Florence testified. The first inquest returned an open verdict, while the second returned one of willful murder, though no one was ever charged or arrested. Following this, Florence moved to Hampshire. She died at the age of 33 from alcohol poisoning in 1878. Mary Rogers. Not much is known about Mary Rogers' early life. Born sometime in 1820 in Connecticut, she was the only child of a widowed mother. Her father, James, died in a steamboat explosion when she was 17. Afterwards, she and her mother relocated to New York City, where she took a job as a clerk in a tobacco shop. She was given a generous wage, as her striking good looks brought in wealthy customers from all across NYC. She was so well known for her beauty that men would write about her. One published a poem in the New York Herald, and she later became the inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe's detective story, The Mystery of Marie Roget. On October 5th, 1838, the Sun reported that Mary Rogers had vanished from her home. Her mother, Phoebe, stated that she'd discovered a suicide note and that she'd had the local coroner examine it. He analyzed the document and claimed that it showed a fixed and unalterable determination to destroy herself. However, the next day, another newspaper wrote that the disappearance was a hoax and that Mary had simply been away visiting a friend. Still, several days passed before she finally returned to work. Yet another local paper suggested that Mary's disappearance had been an elaborate publicity stunt set up by the tobacco shop owner to draw in business. 3 years would pass before Mary's case truly began. On October 25th, 1841, she told her fiancé, a man named Daniel Payne, that she planned to go and visit her family. However, when she didn't return the following day, her mother grew concerned and placed an ad in the paper asking if anyone had seen her daughter. 2 days later, Mary's body was found floating in the Hudson River in New Jersey. It was found by 3 men who took a boat out to retrieve the body and pull her ashore. In news reports pertaining to the death, Mary was referred to as the beautiful cigar girl. She had been strangled using fabric torn from her dress and had ligature marks around her wrists, though her hands were not bound at the time of her discovery. A cord, attached to a heavy stone, had been tied around her waist. Furthermore, her clothing had been torn and her face disfigured. She was not pregnant at the time of her death, and despite popular theories at the time, the injuries she had sustained did not line up with those received during a botched abortion. Her case received national attention and was heavily sensationalized in newspapers. In the subsequent months, her fiancé, reportedly heartbroken over the loss, took his own life. A note was found with his body on October 7th, 1841, which read, "To the world, here I am on the very spot. May God forgive me for my misspent life." Notably, though Daniel had cooperated with investigators and gave consistent statements, he had no interest in viewing Mary's body and didn't ask what had happened to his wife-to-be, drawing some suspicion towards him. Around this same time, Frederica Loss, a tavern owner, claimed to have found several items of women's clothing, possibly belonging to Mary, after her children discovered them in the woods. The most notable piece of clothing strewn around was a handkerchief, embroidered with the initials M.R. Frederica then claimed she'd seen Mary in the company of a tall, dark stranger on the night of her disappearance, and that later on she'd heard a scream come from the woods, the same woods where the clothing was found. In October of 1842, Frederica was shot accidentally by one of her sons. On her deathbed, she explained that the tall, dark stranger she had seen Mary with on the night of her disappearance was not, in fact, a stranger, but a doctor known for performing abortions. She claimed that the procedure had gone wrong and Mary had died as a result. After her body was thrown into the river, one of Frederica's sons tossed the clothing into a neighbor's pond before changing his mind and scattering them around the woods. The Smithsonian Magazine has noted that this information does not entirely line up with the facts of the case, that Mary had been bound, abused, and had clearly struggled against her attacker, and that there were no signs of pregnancy or an abortion. Despite this, back in 1842, many believe Frederica's testimony to be an acceptable version of events. Mary's slaying was never solved. It remains one of NYC's most iconic and horrifying historic cases. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.